And we are live. You're watching Interchain Jam, a series on Interchain FM, the Cosmos radio station. If you're seeking alpha in the cosmos, look no further. I'm your host, Chjango Unchained. And I'm here with 0x Jim from Catalyst AMM. He was part of a lot of different projects in the past that you have heard of, and we'll get into his background soon. But before we get started, I'd like to remind you that Interchain FM/Interchain Jam is a public good, and we do all of the post-production and programming for this podcast. So if you'd like to support us, happy to accept delegations to Interchain FM, as well as subscribe to the channel if you want. All right, now to the show. Jim, let's talk about your background so people could get to know you. Catalyst AMM is a relatively new DEX that is popping up in the modular scene. So let's get to your background.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on. So my background, I'm one of two co-founders of Catalyst, which, as you said, is kind of like a modular liquidity layer for Cosmos and beyond. And for me, like I've been in crypto for about 6 years now, at least full time, and then a little bit longer. It's just like kind of like a hobbyist. But my background's always been in like product. So most recently, I was at Aave, leading the new products team there. And so that was there. It was there where I was kind of doing like some Cosmos stuff and also a lot of like interoperability work. And then before that, I was kind of bopping around. I was at Unstoppable Domains as a PM, and then before that, I was at Ripple during kind of like the post ICO days. I've also done like some DAO stuff, like for Gitcoin and Pleaser DAO. So kind of just been all over, mainly in Ethereum, and this is like my first foray into Cosmos.
What was the Cosmos work that you did while at Aave?
Yeah, so like I was the like PM or the lead of the new products team, and so it was kind of like a skunkworks division where we were just thinking about a lot of different kind of opportunities for Aave broadly. So like new products and new kind of verticals for us to go into. One of the things that I was looking into was basically kind of like app chains, right? And so this was kind of on the heels. Was it on the heels? I think even like before like the DYDX announcement, like we were also looking into what it meant to build our own kind of application specific environment. And so was looking into building an app chain using the Cosmos SDK or leveraging some of the other frameworks that are out now, like OP Stack and Arbitrum Orbit, to kind of build our own different rollups. They weren't even called those back then. They were just like, I don't know, things that Arbitrum and Optimism were doing. And so I had like a pretty good like deep dive into like all the different stacks and like what it meant to build our own sovereign chain and how we can optimize it for Aave specific use cases. So that was kind of like my main Cosmos specific work as it pertained to Aave.
Where did that conversation go before you left?
As it relates to,
I mean, is there some future roadmap for Aave of Aave becoming its own application specific chain?
I mean, can definitely can't speak to
But that was
kind of where they're
explored.
going with that. It was explored, yeah, from kind of my team's mandate. But I mean, like from my perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense, right? It's like I don't need to belabor the point why it's really great to make your own app chain outside of like the ethos of like sovereignty and everything. There's like so much technical customizations that you can do, and also like the economic capture you can have from it. So I think it just makes a lot of sense. And like, you know, it's only, I think right now, really good for like marquee applications that have like a ton of volume. So kind of like checks all the boxes. There were like a couple considerations that weren't really kind of ideal for like an app specific instance for them. And that was kind of like one of the mandates of Catalyst really was kind of the ability to kind of seamlessly interoperate between all the different deployments, right? And so that was kind of like the aha moment for me, where I was like thinking about Catalyst and effectively solving the pain points of like myself at Aave, but also just like other, dApp builders that are trying to build their own app chains or rollups. And again, it all comes down to like interoperability, composability across different domains, etc.
Right. Well, one of the theses that I have with the applications that start on Ethereum that end up building their own app chains, like usually it's part of this evolutionary process that they like a growing pains process that they need to undergo because they've just received too much volume that the base layer Ethereum or even a ostensibly scaling solution like Arbitrum can or Starkware can handle, right? To a point where they're compelled to transition to their own app chains. But at the same time, if you do that at this moment, you trade off the network effects of being part of and the portability of being part of the EVM ecosystem. So now
Yeah.
that's a perfect segue to what Catalyst can do because it seems like you're a liquidity aggregator for not just cross chain, but cross ecosystem of chains that are completely incompatible, excluding UTXO chains, because that's just a different beast on
It's
its
a whole
own.
different beast.
Mm.
Yeah. Certainly possible in probably the future, but not like a huge priority for us right now. Um, Yeah, but I think you said it like perfectly, right? It's like right now, if you want to be your own application specific environment, like you need to have like some sort of like drawing power, right? It's like either your DYDX and everyone just kind of migrates because they just want to use the product that DYDX has and the services it provides, or you're something like that honestly like doesn't even really touch existing crypto users, which is like a game, right? It's like a game, or like maybe even like Web3 social, like they can draw other users and use crypto in the back end, but like not really expose to their users. So they don't even care that they're on like some far away kind of chain that's not really connected to anything, right? Um, I think like if you're not quite there, right? If you still need some level of like connectivity, it becomes a lot harder of a sell to like be your own application specific domain, right? And so I'm trying to like lower that barrier essentially with Catalyst. And basically the TLDR in Catalyst is it's a liquidity network, right? All that we do is basically facilitate the movement of values between different chains and different ecosystems. But the way that we do it is like kind of unique in the sense that, as you said, like we can span ecosystems, right? So it's like we've built like a liquidity kind of mechanism that allows us to be in any any environment like pretty easily, right? And so it's like we could be on Cosmos, whether it be the straight WASM implementation, or more kind of specifically and increasingly so the COSM WASM version. And then we can also be on EVM chains within Cosmos or even outside Cosmos. We can be on Solana. We can be on Sui and Aptos and some sort of like move paradigm. And so we're trying to break down like the barriers that we even see right now in existing ecosystems. And I'm happy to talk more about like how that actually occurs, but like that's basically like the TLDR of what we're trying to accomplish.
First of all, let's preface it with the constraints and why it's been so difficult to achieve so far, and how or what tools in the stack Catalyst utilizes to enable the future of cross ecosystem interoperability.
Yeah, it's been really difficult, I think, to do this so far because
Well,
kind
what
of
what
the
are the
yeah.
specific challenges with doing that? Like what sorts of infrastructure was missing prior, and what did you need to use now to enable that?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing that was kind of a blocker for this was basically an ability to kind of span these like different ecosystems. And so when you look at like Cosmos to Ethereum, for example, I still think like even to this date, there's still like a bit of a like an open field on like how you like on different solutions competing against each other on how you actually want to connect Cosmos to Ethereum. So you have like Axelar, you have like Gravity Bridge, I suppose, and then now like Wormhole kind of entered the fray, right? They made their gateway announcement, but it's still kind of like up in the air and has not really been settled yet.
Yeah,
And
we're
quite
y- we're
frankly,
you we're using these archaic, clunky, like middleware, like these middle blockchains as intermediaries. When the ideal is to connect like a Cosmos hub and Ethereum main chain directly.
yeah, absolutely. It's like we're using these like separate validators. These, could be a chain in the context of
And yeah,
Axelar,
and
could be
each
like
has a
a
trust
Guardian network.
assumption.
Yeah, totally. And like that's like not the ideal, right? And I know you had like Bo on, maybe like a couple weeks back from Polymer, and like I think what they're building is like very much like the ideal, where it's like okay, you have at least minimized trust assumptions to actually connect these different domains, and you're doing so by bringing IBC and making it compatible with like Ethereum mainnet and its rollups, right?
Yeah. And one of the main like incremental changes the space has undergone was Ethereum's merge and transition to proof of stake, because before, like ahead of that, there was no hope for the other proof of stake ecosystems to really more easily interoperate with Ethereum.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. In a proof of work context, it would have been nearly impossible, I would say. At least now there's like some sort of solutions, right? Where it's like you can use like the sync committee on Ethereum, and it's like kind of like a subset of all the validators that are voting on blocks. So all that to be said, it's like there's still these like kind of intermediary solutions that are connecting ecosystems. But I think over time, as some of the technology around like ZK snarks and around like Polymer bringing IBC to other ecosystems, it becomes a lot easier to kind of interconnect those pieces. So I think that's kind of like a really big barrier that we've seen and are still seeing, right? And we're hoping kind of gets resolved over time. Um, so that's one piece. I think the second piece is like when you look at it in the context of like liquidity and how liquidity is being kind of like leveraged, like within different chains. It looks very. It's kind of like a trade off, right? It's like on one end, it's either like very fragmented, so you have like you have Sushi Swap or Uniswap, for example. It's like every chain has their own deployment, and they all have to like use their look start from zero from a liquidity perspective, have to bootstrap it, have to like get all these pairs set up, and it's different for each chain, right? So it's like that's like on one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, it's like you have hubs that are like basically like chains that are trying to centralize liquidity and be a coordinator for liquidity, which has its own kind of UX and hurdles and trust assumptions. And so things like Osmosis and chain flip and Thor chain kind of come to mind. And again, like we don't really see this as like the right ends of the spectrum, right? It's like it's not like a discrete choice where you have to say no, you need to have this like fragmented liquidity path, or you need to have this like centralized hub path. And so what we kind of advocate instead is basically like an aggregated liquidity layer where these each specific chain is basically using their own liquidity to facilitate swaps, but they do so in like a way that doesn't fragment it. So it's like each asset in each chain basically like you use the whole amount of that asset in order to facilitate a swap between another chain, which we could talk more about how that actually works underneath the hood. But by doing that, by like leveraging these like native assets to facilitate swaps, you can actually bring them beyond different ecosystem contexts, right? So it's like no longer is it like, oh, here's a Uniswap smart contract. It only works within an EVM context, right? Um, Now it's like, well, it's basically like let's say like Solana, for example, right? It's like Solana has a very, very different kind of virtual machine context in which Uniswap can never be in. But for Catalyst, it's like all it has to do is just leverage its native assets. It leverages the aggregated amount of those assets, and you're allowed to facilitate swaps between some sort of Ethereum chain, right? And again, we can talk more about how that actually works, but conceptually, that's what we're basically allowing chains to do now. We're allowing them to have a lot more sovereignty and a lot more power with the liquidity that they have within their own chain.
Right. So you're allowing people to have those benefits without trading off the usual trade-offs in the trade-off space they used to have to function in.
Yeah, yeah. That's
Okay.
that's a good way of putting it.
All right. Well, all right. Let's talk about that. Well, first of all, we should define what you mean by native assets, right? Like, what is that? Because I don't consider a wrapped Bitcoin or even okay. Imagine we're in the Osmosis context, and I'm trying to swap Bitcoin, wrapped Bitcoin that is bridged over from EVM. That is in no way, shape, or form native asset compared to like just Bitcoin, right? Like you would
Yeah.
get on a centralized exchange. So can you define that?
Yeah. So when I think our definition of a native asset is um, similar to the one that you're articulating. I think the main kind of definition that we have for a native asset is one that is not reliant on um, how do I say this? It's like not reliant on some sort of like third party entity to like,
Like a bridge
yeah, exactly, like a
or like a
bridge to basically like control the movement of it, right? So it's like this is like the home ledger in which this asset was created, and you're just leveraging that asset, right? And so it's like when you're trying
okay.
to wrap Bitcoin, bring it somewhere else, and you're using it on Ethereum or you're using it on Osmosis, it's like that's not a native asset anymore. That becomes like a wrapped asset or a bridged asset.
Okay, so your definition is not to say that uh is not to say that so like wrapped Bitcoin is an ERC20 on Ethereum, right?
Yeah.
And then they have did they so is it are you defining that as a native asset?
No, I'm not. I'm
No.
saying like Bitcoin is a native asset to the Bitcoin network, right?
Right.
And so
Okay.
when you're like issuing wrap Bitcoin anywhere else, you're basically reliant on like BitGo that like custodies
Yeah,
this
so that's
Bitcoin
not
and issues it.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
We 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 are on the same page about that definition. Okay, so your claim is that Catalyst enables trading activity on native assets. Does that include Bitcoin? How?
Um, that does not include Bitcoin right
Okay.
now, but it's
Right.
something that we're
UTXO
actively
chains.
researching. Yeah, exactly.
Great. Got it. Okay. Now we could move on. All right. Let's talk
Okay,
about how Catalyst enables this, swapping of native assets,
sure.
excluding native assets of UTXO chains.
Yeah. So I think the best way to think about a catalyst is it's basically like three layers. So the first layer is like by far the most important. It's basically like um, it's like a vault that stores all the assets, right? And so in the context of like, like a Cosmos chain, like let's say like a CosmWasm chain, like it would basically be like a CosmWasm smart contract, for us written in Rust that you can deposit these assets into, right? And again, it's different for Solana, it's different for Ethereum, it's different for Move, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of like the first layer. The second layer is basically a mathematical library, and this is where it kind of like calculates the um, it like calculates and coordinates the liquidity between different vaults, and so that's how you're allowed to like basically coordinate cross chain the different liquidity that's deposited in each of these vaults. And then the last piece is like a messaging aggregator. where basically we can use any sort of like messaging protocol in order to actually pass those messages between chains, right? And so we were talking earlier about like IBC, which we use and are proud to use, but we can really use any sort of message passing framework, whether it be like a wormhole or an Axelar as well. And again, that just gives us more access to other chains that we can swap into, right? Um, and so that's kind of like how Catalyst works at a high level. And so I think where it's helpful to double click is actually that middle layer is the math library. And so again, like this is where kind of the quote unquote like magic happens, where let's say you have two vaults that have assets on, let's say you have Ethereum and then let's say you have Neutron, right? So again, like we're specifically using like a Cosmos app chain and versus like Ethereum mainnet. Basically what happens is like if people want to move value between these two different chains, this is where the math library comes in to ensure that there's kind of like a equivalent amount of value being passed through it, right? And so if people want to, let's say, move native USDC and they want to move it onto Neutron, or not move it, sorry, if they want to essentially trade it, right? So it's like they want to trade native USDC and they want to acquire some Cosmos assets on Neutron. Basically, the math library calculates how much you want to sell on the Ethereum side and how much you should be acquiring on the Neutron side and keeping it equal, right? And the way that we do that is basically using this thing called the unit of liquidity, which we've written a white paper about. But the TLDR of it is basically it allows for, it's kind of like it's like a liquidity calculation, right? So if you deposit like 100 USDC on the Ethereum side, you will get the liquidity equivalent amount on the Neutron side every single time, right? And so said differently, it's kind of like a receipt. And so you can always redeem like 1,000 USDCs worth of liquidity on Neutron, or in this instance for Catalyst, it can work with any Catalyst chain, right? So it's like you sell your 1,000 USDC, you get this receipt, and now you can kind of redeem it on any Catalyst vault on any chain. And so that's like basically how Catalyst enables like native asset swaps between different ecosystems. Is there's this simplified and generalized concept of this unit of liquidity that we just like shop around and can be redeemed by any user on any chain.
Okay. Help me understand the architecture a little bit. So Catalyst AMM is its own, is it like an SDK chain, or where does it sit on the stack?
Yeah, so we're kind of building something weird where it doesn't have its own chain. It's literally just smart contracts that live on like each respective domain.
Okay, right. So and that's the way that you receive and sell and manage the inventory of native assets on each of their host chains.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay, and then there's the math library logic that basically like lets you do some routing for like settling these swaps across these different chains.
Yeah. It's like it's less of a route. It's more of like a conversion to a value that every Catalyst vault understands and knows how to convert
Okay,
in and
right.
out of. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, to put it in tangible terms in the form of a metaphor, you're the exchange, the currency exchange desk after someone arrives at the airport or departs from an airport, whatever.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty good analogy. Yeah.
Mm.
It's like, imagine it's like when you look at like global, like let's like plan this analogy. I totally agree. I think that's a good analogy. I think it's like the unit of liquidity as an analogy is basically like it's like a made up currency that everyone agrees that they can swap with, right? So it's
Oh,
like
so
when
you basically you've created this synthetic world, digital world reserve currency equivalent.
yeah, but again, it's not even like synthetic. It's literally like a value, right? It's not a token
Wait,
in any
how does it
way.
work? Is it a unit of account? Like
Yeah,
you're claiming that it
effectively.
has like some properties of money.
No. There's no monetary property of it. It's literally a value, right?
Mm.
It's like it allows for just like liquidity to be determined, or rather, it allows like yeah, like not a unit of account, but it's like it allows for like a value to be determined for any asset that you want to swap, right?
Yeah. So does this feature replace the need for an oracle?
Yeah, it's an Oracle-less system.
Okay. And what motivated your team to develop this instead of the conventional, depending on an oracle?
Yeah, so like there's kind of like two ways to I think like when we were designing Catalyst, there were two conventional ways in which you can do kind of like a cross-chain like some sort of like cross-chain swap platform. So the first one was basically like being a bridge effectively. And so like when you look at like Thorchain's design, it's like they have this chain that has all these validators, and they're basically monitoring the state of all the other chains that they can support, right? And in order to like actually facilitate the swaps between all of them, you need to like, I mean, I'm kind of like generalizing it. I'm adding in kind of the implementations of other similar projects, but it's like you need to bridge those assets from their like origin chain to this like swap chain. And then there needs to be some sort of like intermediary asset in order to actually do the swap, right? And so for Thorchain's example, they would use like Rune, right? And
Right. Yeah.
so
You're talking about like a base currency,
yeah, exactly.
the base pair.
Yeah. And so that's not an Oracle system, right? But it's like a system that relies on some sort of like shared base currency
Yeah.
as
Like in a
a
pricing mechanism. Uh huh.
yeah, exactly, as a base pair for those swaps. And so it's really great if like you're bullish Rune and like you can kind of see the value of it. It's like, okay, like everyone needs to hold Rune, they need to put it on this AMM, they need to do these swaps against it. It has value, right? So that's like one piece, but obviously you can kind of see it's like now you're dependent on this one currency, you need to bootstrap liquidity for it, what have you, right? So like that's kind of like what we
Yeah. And what happens
see.
when people become bearish that
Yeah.
currency?
Yeah, it's the same mechanisms at play, right? On the way up and on the way down. Um, so there's that piece. And the other piece is like leveraging an Oracle, which has its own issues, right? It's like you have to pay for that Oracle. You have to be relying on whatever kind of Oracle system you're using. There's all sorts of front running that happen with that Oracle. So that's just something that we weren't really interested in doing either. And so we looked at kind of like the first design and we basically said, okay, what if we just like replace the currency with just like a value, right? And so that's basically the kind of ethos around what the unit liquidity is. It's like, okay, it's like a base currency that you don't need to like actually actively maintain the liquidity for those pairs, right? And so if we want to use our Forex example, it's like I have Brazilian real, and I want to get like I don't know, like Danish
Lyra,
crowns, right? Yeah, sure.
whatever. Yeah.
It's like originally you had to go through USDC or some other major, but like now we facilitate a way for that market to be, instead of like a two-step market, to be a one-step market. And that's kind of like the innovation of what we created.
Mm. So yeah. So is this unit of liquidity a unit of account? Like I need to use the mental model of the US dollar, right? So does it have a pegged value, so to speak, associated with it, or is it more of like a receipt of the total value of like one swap? It's more of like an appraisal of the receipt, and then like it's
Yeah,
more
it's more the
dynamic than
latter.
the got it.
Yeah, because like there could be arbitrage, right? There could be like a mispricing between two different assets. And so essentially like like any AMM relies on like sophisticated entities like arbitrageurs to basically ensure that this receipt is actually giving you the market like competitive amount, right? So there's a world where it's like I sell 1 ETH, but instead of getting like, whatever the market price is of it right now, worth of like Matic on Polygon, I get like $1,000 worth of Matic, right? And I'm like, oh, that was like insane slippage that like wasn't really that helpful, right? But then there's an ARB opportunity there where we're working with like these kind of arbitrage entities to ensure that there's like harmonization of the prices effectively. So that's how it like becomes Oracleist, right? It's like you're basically working with these arbitrageurs who are like self-motivated to keep the prices synchronized between pools.
All right. So how does your math library, the unit of liquidity, work?
Yeah. So
It's just a black box right now.
yeah, and it shouldn't be. And it takes a while, and we're still working on the right way to kind of articulate it. But basically, it's like an integral. And so when you look at like an AMM, right, you have like a constant product market maker. You have like the pretty standard X times Y equals K curve that people are familiar with, right? Um, that works in the context of like the x-axis and the y-axis being like two separate assets, right? And so it's like Uniswap always works because it's like this x times y equals k, and you kind of follow this invariant to ensure the kind of the redemption of assets along either side of the axes. We effectively like break that like graph into two pieces. And so instead of having an x-axis and a y-axis, sorry, this is probably more helpful with like visuals, but instead of having a like an x-axis and a y-axis with the curve, we effectively have like two versions of the price curve where like the old x-axis and the y-axis become just like x1 and x2. And you can like imagine there's like, they each kind of have like their own curve, right? Like this. And so that's the same as like looking at like ETH to like Matic, right? So it's like ETH on Ethereum to Matic on Polygon. Their vaults each have their own price curve, right? And so if I want to sell ETH and I want to buy Matic, basically I'm moving along the ETH price curve. And that actually like, I would sell it. So I'm moving to the right. And then you can
What is
actually,
ETH paired with?
it's not paired with anything. It's just like a single asset price curve effectively.
Well, it must be relative to some like some value, like the US dollar, right?
Um, it doesn't need to be. No.
Well,
This
so
this is
what is it?
so like let's take the ETH graph, right? So it's like this is the ETH graph. So there's still an x-axis. Sorry, there's an x-axis which is ETH, and there's a y-axis which you don't really care about. But then there's a price curve along it, right? And so we just call that P of X. And so when you're moving along that price curve, it basically generates an integral. Excuse me. And that integral, like the actual amount of that integral is the unit of liquidity, or our, X amount of units of liquidity. And then we send that as a message. And then when you look at the price curve of the Matic side, again, it still has pretty similar looking price curve. You basically just say, hey, I want to move alongside this price curve, like on the x-axis. So I want to move along this side, this price curve, such that it generates the same amount of area underneath the curve. And you need to tell me what the delta in the x-axis for this graph will be.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's much, much easier when I have
Right.
like a graphic, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's basically what it is.
Okay. Right. How, I mean, is there any market validation that you've seen so far about how this is a more effective pricing mechanism as compared to whatever, status quo?
Um, so Candidly, like this is definitely a bet, right? But it's a calculated bet. So we're on testnet. We're live on 3 chains, and we hope to add more over time. So we're on Chronos, Canto, and then Scroll. And so you can facilitate swaps through, any kind of permutation of those 3. And then we also have like a stable swap pool, right? So you can move like DAI and Tether and Note and stuff like that. And it's a pretty effective. I mean, like the mechanism works, which is good. Whether it is price effective is well, it is in theory as price effective as like Uniswap, but
which is pretty just pretty it incurs pretty high slippage still.
for large swaps, I would say, and so yeah, I mean, like this is not the end all be all. This is very much like the V1 of the protocol, and we hope to like have much more capital efficiency over time. Um, but it is as good as Uniswap, and it will also be a function of the liquidity that's being put into the protocol, right? So that's kind of what we're trialing with our upcoming mainnet launch.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right. And the Catalyst AMM, where does that sit? Or is that more of like an ethereal thing that you're using to describe the math library?
I would say it's more the latter. So the protocol is basically like
You
it's
don't
like a
actually
smart
have it like a
contract.
DEX for this. It's just like the math logic that you're running.
Yeah, precisely. It's like
Okay,
Catalyst
that makes
as a
sense.
protocol is like, well, it's one of two things. One is like it's the code, right? It's like the way in which you use the math library, and also the other pieces, right? It's like the vaults and the messaging aggregator. And then 2, it's also just like the composite view of all the different deployments, right? So it's like Catalyst is like its deployment on Scroll and on Chronos and on Canto and on Neutron and Say, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of like, I don't know. It has a bit of an identity, uh, kind of, it has to piece together its identity in a
Mm-hmm.
way.
Yeah, I mean, from the 30,000 foot high view, it looks. I mean, the architecture looks or conceptually looks similar to layer 0 and how they do it. So
Yeah, it's like point to point, like hyperlane.
right, yeah. Okay, I mean, so I'm curious how this compares to Squid and how they do it. It sounds pretty similar to Squid, in terms of you have like similar goals, but architecturally it's different.
Yeah, so Squid is a router, right? So it's like they're always trying to offer their users like the best route to execute a swap. And so that can be through one step, which is just, hey, like, we're gonna move this stable coin to another stable coin, and we're gonna do it using an Axel USD. Like you were gonna, use Axel USDC for it. Or it could be like multi-leg, right? So it's like, oh, we're going to swap this asset for another asset on the origin chain. Then we're going to bridge it with Axel USDC, and then we're going to swap it again, right? And so you can probably see there, it's like they're basically like very intelligently using all of the liquidity venues at their disposal to get users the best price. Um, our team at Catalyst, we feel very strongly that we can get the user the best price on a lot of assets that aren't actually even being served right now in the space. So we hope, to use Squid effectively as their kind of as like the like another way in which we can give Squid's users like better price execution. So effectively, like Squid would use our liquidity venues for some of their routing.
Oh, okay, interesting. So yeah, you guys are more value additive in an additional piece of infrastructure for
Yeah,
finding efficient pricing. That's
yeah,
nice.
totally.
Got it. Cool. All right. Any housekeeping items you want to go through? Are there announcements that you could get listeners excited for?
Yeah, definitely. So we have, like I said, we have testnet out, which is demo.catalyst.exchange, just on 3 networks. It's kind of like a proof of concept, I would say. It's definitely not all the bells and whistles that we want to have for the protocol. And so we're going to have like a real, like official full testnet launch next month, which is going to have support for a lot more chains. And we'll have kind of full functionality as it pertains to deposit withdrawals and pool creations and liquidity mining, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this is all in testnet, but again, we're kind of just trying to kick the tires ahead of mainnet. And so that's going to happen next month. And then we do want to be on mainnet in December. So those are kind of like our 2 major timelines.
Very exciting. Well, I wish you the best of luck for mainnet launch. And I think that this is good timing because you have maybe a year or so before we have a bull market again and things go crazy. And that's usually when people do all of the building to catalyze usage of the bull market.
Exactly. Yeah. We're trying to time it right for sure. But when we'll stay heads down building
Yeah.
until that glorious moment.
Right. And you give yourself time to work out all the kinks too. Great.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And even by then, like we'll probably have like a V2, which will be like much, much, more efficient and hardened and everything. So excited for that to come out.
Right. Yeah. So when can we look forward to Catalyst supporting all the existing dexes that are in the Cosmos ecosystem?
That will be well, it's hard for me to say all, right? But we do want to
Like, is that
support.
part of mainnet launch or is it after, maybe more part of V2?
Not part of V2. Like, so mainnet will, like, again, it's like Catalyst is um, like always a function of what chains the protocol is going to be on. And so it's always like an ongoing kind of development effort to be on more and more chains and support more and more domains. And so, we have like, we're, really excited to kind of showcase all the domains that we're going to be supporting for our like full testnet next month. I think it's going to include all the major kind of domains that people want to see. And then that's obviously going to translate to mainnet as well. And then it'll be kind of like a incremental support, right, of more and more. It's kind of like other applications, like over time, they're like, hey, like now we're on this chain and now we're on this chain. They kind of do like a cadence of announcements. We anticipate doing that as well. So still an ongoing effort, even post mainnet.
Are you able to share the sequencing that you guys have of which chains is support? No? All right, fine.
No, but I will say, like, when we have our full testnet out, it's going to capture like 70, if not like 80+% of people's desires from a chain perspective.
Why?
Because it's all the best ones.
The best what? The best chains or the best price?
The best chains. Yeah.
Okay. So like as a user, what would compel me to use this? Is it like better pricing?
Yeah. So it's one thing would be better pricing for like assets that you would want to get access to. And then another piece is like we're actually going to be supporting assets that we don't even think are being supported right now.
Better pricing compared to what? Other decentralized exchanges, or does that also include centralized exchanges?
I would say it would include both.
Okay, all right. Well, yeah, that's strictly an improvement over the status quo. So
Yeah.
right.
And again, that's like for like popular like pairs that we already see. We even think there's going to be like we're going to offer pairs that just aren't in the market right now.
Well, I don't know. One would argue that the pairs that aren't in a lot of the markets is because they well, either they don't have the liquidity and are legitimate projects, or they don't have the liquidity and are rug pulls, or like slow rugs, straight up rug pulls, just like scam coin, shit coin, or they are like the hexes of the world, where somebody, like one person, has over 95% of the total token supply or whatever. You mean like that, or like what else would people want that doesn't fall into that case?
I mean, like, I'm not gonna like prescribe what these projects are, but they are like projects that people want when you look at it from a volume perspective, um, or brand new projects, right? So we want to give people brand new projects on brand new domains, right? So it's like we want to give people access to those.
Okay, that an experimental feature on Uniswap doesn't already provide.
Sorry, I'm not familiar with what you're referring
Or
to.
I mean, yeah, like someone just like deploying a pool on Uniswap, and that's not been vetted or by the team. It's like
I don't.
experimental.
You mean like permissionless or?
Yeah, like someone permissionlessly creating a pool for a coin that's not listed anywhere else. Like we'll just use Hex as an example.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, but I
Okay.
get the gist of what you're trying to say when you use that as an example. So
Okay.
you're saying like
I'm saying that for low liquidity coins, they do have the option to do that on Uniswap, like on Osmosis Frontier, for instance, to permissionlessly add new untested pairs.
new coins on new domains though,
What do you mean by new domains?
like new chains. I think that's where it gets interesting.
Okay, what would be an example of that?
Like
You mean like
something,
chains that don't have a native DEX on it?
just new chains, right? I can't like speak to like what they don't or don't have, but it's like new. If I have, like majors on a major network, I can access and acquire new assets on new chains through Catalyst.
Okay.
Right. So it's like, I mean, like how many, like there's so many new chains that are coming out, right? It's like, it seems like there's more every day. There's like Linea and Scroll and Manta Pacific. And from the Cosmos side, you have Say and you have Barachain, right? It's like, there's only going to be more and more chains. Like that's like a thesis that, my team believes really strongly in. And I think that we're very well positioned to service those just from the way in which the protocol is architected.
Yeah, are you saying that you're able to basically front run whatever like dexes that might launch on those chains, and already provide liquidity for them before they have a dex?
I think we're going to be one of the first apps on a lot
Okay,
of desired chains and
right.
rollups.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
I
I
see.
think
I
we're
see
going to
what
be
you're
like a
saying now.
marquee app on lots of these new chains and rollups.
Okay, yeah, I get it. All right, cool. Have we covered everything that you wanted to cover?
Yeah, pretty much. I'd say so.
Perfect. Well, thanks for coming on Interchain FM. And yeah, thanks for the listeners who tuned in live or are listening in the future. If you want to tune into our podcast, we live stream every Thursday. If it's a normal Thursday, if I'm not traveling for a conference or anything like that. So yeah, thanks for coming on, Jim. I've been following Catalyst for a couple months now, so excited about the developments that you guys have made. And yeah, I may want to try it in the future.
Yeah, very, very soon. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.